It's Momo Monday, and so we start with 2 deep breaths. Breathe in and out. And breathe in. And out. And I thought this Momo Monday I'd do something a little bit different. I'd share with you guys a bit of a conundrum I'm having regarding this whole cultural appropriation issue, because some of you may know, I've talked about it in the past. I grew up in a neighborhood of Toronto that was called the Jane and Finch neighborhood. It was a very multicultural neighborhood, a mix of a bunch of different groups, and there was a large Afro-Caribbean community, as well as quite a few Asian kids, Indian kids, Pakistani kids, Afghani kids, Somali, a whole bunch of different groups that came over, and it's an immigrant community. It was low income, and so a lot of immigrant groups, it was their first stop when they came to Canada. And because of that, I have grown up seeing as normal things that to someone who does not know my background would consider cultural appropriation. And this puts me in a difficult situation, because culture, it intersects with race, it intersects with religion, but culture is over and above religion and race, right? Video game culture is its own thing. And this is why I am so adamant that we should not attach race or gender to the identity of gamer. Because the other thing I get all the time is people telling me I don't look Jewish. And that can be hilarious. It can be very, very frustrating when old ladies at the kosher supermarket decide I'm an interloper and ram their shopping carts into my Achilles tendon. That's fun. And that's sort of what happens online in a lot of cases with this cultural appropriation thing. People online think that because they're offended, it gives them the right to attack. And this is concerning when it comes to a country like Canada, where we pride ourselves on our multiculturalism here. And because of that, I have a friend who's white South African. He's actually originally from South Africa. And he has South African cultural elements to his experience that he is uncomfortable expressing in public, in part because, white South Africa, they're the villains of the traditional narrative, even though the reason his family ended up in Canada is his father opposed apartheid. And he worked for the government, so they had to get out because those people were persecuted. People who opposed apartheid within power structures were persecuted quite badly, so they had to get out of South Africa and come to Canada. But that is his cultural heritage, growing up in South Africa. But if he expresses certain elements of that, he risks being accused of cultural appropriation. This is also I remember back in the day, remember when Gwen Stefani was in No Doubt and she wore the bindi? Now that is a religious, the bindi, the dot in the center of the forehead, that is a religious observance. And this to me is the center of cultural appropriation, that it comes down to this question of sincerity and whether an act is being done sincerely or cynically, or worse, mockingly. And that is very subjective. And I'm talking about this now in part because I've been mulling it around a lot, but the example that finally decided to have me go at it in this way was I read a wonderful piece by Jonathan Kay in the National Post about this whole phenomenon. And an MP named Nikki Ashton apologized to Black Lives Matter Vancouver for appropriating Beyonce lyrics, specifically the "To the left," the song from Dreamgirls. And I was like, what? Pop music? That's a pop song. And as Jonathan Kay pointed out, it was written among other people, a Norwegian songwriter. And the problem is, in those situations, they're wrong. You can't claim pop music that's everywhere, that's played, in its first iteration everywhere, in white neighborhoods, in black neighborhoods, all that stuff. You can't really claim that's cultural appropriation. Pop music, by its definition, is mainstream Western culture. And the super important thing about pop music now is that anyone of any race can, on paper at least, participate. There are no racial boundaries, and that wasn't always true. That wasn't always true. Back in the jazz days, back when recording artists like Billie Holiday, and I believe Ed James as well, black tunes, black songs, if they thought they could be popular with white audiences, were re-recorded by white singers and distributed. So there were two radically different musical cultures. There was black music, and I'm sure you would not be surprised to find out they made a lot less money because they could only market their music to black consumers. And then there were white singers. There was white music. And that was the stuff that was played on the radio and all that stuff. Fortunately, we have progressed and do not live in... It's shocking, right, to hear about this stuff. But cultural appropriation does still happen. The issue we have up in Canada is... Some of you may know that First Nations people have a lot of struggles, a lot of challenges facing them. And so people get understandably upset when fashion designers take Indigenous people's garment patterning, like the stuff that looks like it was done by an Inuit person or, Indian groups. And they just make it fast fashion. It's just screen printed on. Or there's no... And the thing about a lot of these patterns is they have ritualistic or religious symbolism. And that I totally understand. Remember when Nicki Minaj dressed up as like a Roman Catholic priest and everybody freaked out? Well, if you're going to freak out when someone uses your religious symbols in a non-ritualistic context, if people are not supposed to dress up like the Pope, or people are not supposed to dress up like a minister. I mean, Madonna got in trouble for her Like a Prayer video back in the day because she made the Jesus figure in that black, and she actually kissed a black man playing Jesus, and that was considered offensive back in the day. She was trying to make a point about race and offense and everything like that, and Madonna just doesn't give a damn. So, pardon the pun. But, these were all things and causing offense. I grew up because of when I grew up. These offensive uses of imagery actually opened the door to more racial inclusion. So now it's very strange to me that people would not want their images, their cultural images used anywhere. Like Mario wearing a sombrero in Mario Odyssey. That seems like a foolish thing to complain about because a sombrero is just a hat. There is no religious significance to that. You can't say the same thing about an Indian headdress. Those are ritual garments and you have to earn them. They mean different things. So I can totally understand why someone would not want their ceremonial garments used, mass produced cheaply and used by drunken frat boys at parties. That makes sense to me. And that's something I think everybody can understand. It is disrespectful. But we have gotten to the point where writer friends of mine don't want to include characters of certain races, of certain ethnic backgrounds, because they don't want to be attacked for cultural appropriation. Now, the concern about that for me is, say one of these stories gets optioned and they avoided using an Indigenous Canadian character because they didn't want the mob descending on them. Well, when that's made into a movie or a TV show, that means that a character that could have been initially an Indigenous person now either has to be changed to that, or you don't have inclusion of people of that, background in a work that could actually create someone a job, right? And you got to be careful to represent these cultures appropriately, but usually the people I know are fantasy writers, and so they're basing a group within a not real world on something real world. And this concerns me for obvious reasons, because that same inclusion that we didn't have in pop music, and now we do, needs to extend to literature, to things that can provide jobs when they're adapted for the screen. The reality is that multiculturalism has been a thing in Canada for long enough now that people can do these things and they're sincere about them. They don't know they're doing anything wrong because they're not doing anything wrong. They're doing something from a sincere and respectful place. But then what happens if someone decides, no, you're not sincere, so say we? This is a mob. This is an online mob telling you what's in your heart. That you don't mean what you meant because they don't like it. And we all have a choice in those moments. And I mean, this happened to me with Lady Bits when I was once again accused of being transphobic and trans exclusionary. I stood up and I wouldn't apologize. I wouldn't admit that because they were offended, I was offensive. And sometimes, I'm a big fan of Howard Stern. I mentioned Madonna, Nicki Minaj. These are all people who offend with deliberateness, and there is a role for that in art. And they try to say that, just because you're accused of cultural appropriation, it doesn't mean you yourself are evil or calling out centuries old colonialism and all this stuff, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's not true, because you're basically accusing someone. We know how these activists feel about colonialism. You are accusing someone of an evil act, of an act that oppresses, and people don't want to do that. So that's disingenuous. Now, that being said, I want to be very, very clear. There are issues. The fact that people are still fighting to make Indian people mascots on sporting teams where no actual Indian people play. It's not necessarily the Cleveland Indians name that's the problem. It's that mascot that was basically like a culturally insensitive cartoon that they insisted on using for you. And not growing up, I didn't know that was a problem. And that's the issue, is that, we have to keep in mind that as white people, we are here because of colonialism. Our reasons for being here are different than other people who came over as economic migrants or refugees. And yes, people were coming here for a better life, but certain empires around the world just decided that, hey, this land, this is ours too. Sorry, people who already live here. We're going to try to get along with you until you become bothersome to us, and then we're just going to take everything. And that's important to recognize. And I mean, we have issues where people who don't play games go out into the mainstream world and speak as though they are gamers. And this has led to a distorted view of our hobby and of, some may say, our lifestyle. And we don't like that. And that's how you can sort of empathize and have some compassion for the idea of people don't like seeing their cultural symbols made a mockery of. What I don't understand is we have a branding system for our wine. If you see the letters VQA on a bottle of wine, a Canadian bottle of wine, that means it's grown and cellared in the Ontario wine region. So you're actually buying Canadian wine if that matters to you. I don't know why we can't do the same thing for Indigenous artwork. Find some symbol that indicates that it is authentic so that people who are interested in supporting artists and entrepreneurs from those communities can do so in an informed way. I don't understand why we don't do that and just stop yelling at everybody. This is a question, this whole cultural appropriation issue is about talking to each other. And that's exactly what's not happening. Wanting to have some legitimate nostalgia for my childhood, it doesn't mean I forget that I'm white. It's just that if you take that away from me, you leave me with nothing. And this is why I put it in Momo Monday, because that's like a meditation point. Like, what do you do? And what I do is if something feels right to me, I do it. It doesn't mean I'm not conscious about it. It doesn't mean I don't stop and think. If we strip out all of these cultural symbols, because they're not ours, the media is still very white dominant. And we are essentially suppressing other people's cultural symbols if we do that. And that's the crazy thing. We are going back to the era of black music and white music, and I don't want to go back there. And because of that, the people screaming cultural appropriation have to recognize that they're doing some harm as well. They don't think they are. But if we don't have cultural transference, if we don't have cultural exchanges, then we end up with segregated art. And we don't want that. And that doesn't mean we let everybody be a jerk. It means that just screaming cultural appropriation isn't enough. You have to say why. And it's not my job to explain this to you isn't enough. Yes, it is. You're the one complaining. So hopefully that little meditation helped. If it made you angry, take a breath. And that's why we close off with deep breaths. Deep breathe in. And out. And breathe in. And out.